Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Chase Life podcast with myself, David Godfrey. So today I wanted to take a bit of a deep dive into how to eat in order to be lean, fit and healthy, and also at the same time eliminate struggles with food, such as binge eating, emotional eating, mindless eating, compulsive eating, and so forth, and be able to do the two together at the same time, because I think there are some circles where people believe that these two things are at odds with each other, and they absolutely are not. Of course, you can eliminate struggles with food and establish genuine emotional freedom around food, and also have health, fitness, and well-being goals, and be able to prioritize the behaviors that you need to be consistent with in order to be fit and healthy year round. Of course you can do the two together, but many people just don't know how. And so that's what I wanted to address today. So I'm going to structure the first half of this episode more around what not to do, but unfortunately much of which many people have been taught to do, and have been taught that this is good practice. And then I'll, in the second half, get into what to do instead. So, the first thing that I want to address is getting away from perfectionism. So many of the approaches that people have been using with food are breeding perfectionism and the all or nothing mindset. So let's look at traditional diets first of all. A lot of the typical traditional approaches you'll see in the weight loss industry, the dieting industry, and so forth. And these diets, whether it's paleo, keto, intermittent fasting, they have a bunch of rules, right, for you to stick to. Eat within this window. You're not allowed to eat outside of this window. Only eat these certain foods. These foods are on limits, these foods are off limits, and so on and so forth. There's a certain number of rules for you to stick to, and rules in many ways are very useful because it eliminates the need to think for yourself. You just follow the rules and you lose weight. Awesome. However, unfortunately, like I say, it starts to breed perfectionism because you start to see food as being good food or bad food. And then that escalates into it being either a good day or a bad day. And maybe even categorizing yourself as being good or bad based on whether you can follow the rules or not. And one of the interesting things about feeling like you're on a diet is that the moment that you make something bad or banned or off limits, now you can't stop thinking about it. And it also just creates this feeling of being excessively restricted and controlled and boxed in with no room for error. And of course, that builds this internal pressure. And it builds these internal cravings. And sometimes those cravings build consciously in the sense of you start noticing yourself really having this urge for something to scratch that itch. Sometimes it builds subconsciously, whereby the first time that you're aware of it is when you first give yourself a quote-unquote taste of something. And so whether you just allow yourself a taste of something or whether you just feel like that's your only option because you just got to scratch that itch, I'll just have a taste, I'll just satisfy the urge or the craving. But of course, it's never just a taste, is it? Because the moment that you give yourself permission to just have a taste, your brain goes, oh my God, this is amazing. And I don't know when I'm next going to have this level of freedom or the ability to enjoy and indulge this feeling ever again, because I know that just around the corner, there's yet another extended period of excessive deprivation and restriction and control with no end in sight. So let's satisfy not just this craving, but every future craving I could ever possibly have. Just get it out of your system. And so, of course, that just justifies a binge. And the fact that you've labeled it as a, quote, bad day, now it doesn't matter. Whatever you do for the rest of the day doesn't count in some way. But that's the way that we justify it, right? And so now it doesn't count, so whatever, all bets are off, and you go for it. And of course, the guilt and the remorse comes later, but in the moment, you've got the perfect excuse to indulge the habit. And so that's what happens when we have these diets with rigid rules. Now, unfortunately, the same thing happens with what's typically seen as fitness industry approaches, like counting calories, and even taking that to the point of tracking individual macros, macronutrients, tracking the amount of carbs, fats, and proteins that you're having. And then we've got even more advanced approaches that some people might use, like carb cycling and calorie cycling and so forth. Now, one thing that I want to preface here is that we cannot ignore the science of nutrition and the science of calories. 100% calories matter. Of course, calories matter when it comes to fat loss and weight loss. We can't ignore the science. We can't ignore energy balance. However, it's the process of counting calories long term as a tool to try to regulate your behavior, to try to keep some sense of control over yourself, that actually ends up backfiring and works against your psychology. Now, this is not to say that counting calories is always bad and you shouldn't do it. No, first of all, if somebody is a fitness professional, if they're a personal trainer or a coach, or if they're also a dietitian and nutritionist, firstly, they need to know the science in detail. And also they need to know how to take things to an advanced level when it is appropriate. There are populations that is appropriate for. If we take a stage competitor like a bodybuilder, or we take a competitive athlete who competes in a weight class like a weightlifter, or some kind of martial artist, a wrestler, a boxer, a mixed martial artist, then during the weeks that they are getting ready for their fight or for their competition, then of course they need to be very, very precise. So for sure, for people like that, we definitely need to know how to take things to a much more detailed, advanced, precise strategy. And also, for some people who are completely unaware when it comes to nutrition, there can often be a lot of value in counting calories and even tracking macros for a few days, perhaps, maybe a week or so, purely as an educational tool, because they have absolutely no idea where they're at. So for sure, it's going to be appropriate for those types of instances. But on the whole, for the vast majority of people who want to be lean, fit, and healthy year round, it's complete overkill. You don't need to go to those lengths. And what we find, unfortunately, is so many people who try to achieve their body goals by counting calories and even tracking macros long term, they end up struggling. And it ends up creating this internal psychological environment that is very conducive to perfectionism and to the all or nothing mindset. You know how to be all on. You know how to get everything perfect. And you know how to be all off. But you don't know how to navigate the gray areas and how to be consistent week in, week out. And so how does that happen? Well, there's a number of ways that happens. So one of them being, first of all, is that the greater the degree of control you believe you need to have, the greater the fear of losing control. So I often use a metaphor that I like to call the tightrope analogy. So if you imagine walking across a tightrope, or let's say it's not even a tightrope, it's a plank, and it's on ground level. It's a reasonably wide plank. It's like a foot or two wide, and maybe it's like 3 meters long, and it's flat on the grass. How confident are you that you can walk from one end of the plank to the other without touching the grass? Pretty confident, right? Why? Because you believe that you've got margin for error. And what's the worst that's going to happen if you make a slight mistake? You touch the grass and then you go back to the start and try again. And because you feel like you've got margin for error and you feel confident and relaxed and in control, you just focus on the task at hand instead of what you don't want to do. Now let's take the same plank and elevate it thousands of feet in the air between two skyscrapers. Now how confident are you? Now you've got to cross this vast yawning chasm beneath you. Probably paralyzed, through fear, right? Why? It's the same task. It's the same plank. It's rigid. It's not wobbling. It's not going anywhere. But now you can't put one foot in front of the other. Why? Because you believe you have zero margin for error. What's the worst that can happen if you have a bit of a wobble? You can plummet to your death. So because of that, because you believe you have no margin for error, now you become obsessed with what you don't want to do. Instead of just putting one foot in front of the other, looking at the end of the plank and just walking, now you're obsessed over, don't wobble. And oh my God, did I put too much weight onto my big toe? And what if I make a step that's a little bit too big or a little bit too small, and that cascades into this slow losing of my balance? Don't look down, don't fall. What if I do? You're obsessed on what you don't want to do instead of what you do want to do. And that escalates to the point of just feeling paralyzed. So in a similar way, that's what happens when people feel like they have zero margin for error when it comes to their nutrition, is that they become obsessed with what they don't want. Don't go over the numbers, stick to the numbers at all costs, do not deviate, don't eat these foods or whatever it is. And so they become a slave to the numbers. They panic whenever they're in a situation where they can't perfectly control the numbers. They get very anxious at work functions, at social events. And it just builds and builds and builds this internal pressure of, again, feeling like you're a trapped wasp in a jar, feeling trapped, feeling excessively controlled. And of course, when your brain unconsciously feels excessively controlled and restricted, then it's going to rebel. So that's one of the things that it can encourage and exacerbate. Another thing that it will often do in many people is it creates this disconnect from your body, because it's almost like you're approaching your nutrition from the perspective of, don't trust your body, it's wrong, it's broken, you know what it should need, tell your body what to do and ignore whatever it's telling you. And so now if you're on your menstrual cycle, if you happen to be particularly active that day or awake for longer hours, or maybe you work shift work and you're awake for 24 hours or longer, or maybe you're sick and your appetite's changed, or maybe you start a new workout regime that is way more intense than what you're used to. And so as a result, your appetite significantly increases, or it changes in some way, because of course our metabolism is flexible. You're not a robot fixed at this one amount. And so now when you get these fluctuating signals from your body, you have no idea how to respond. And you just train yourself to just ignore it, just stick to the numbers at all costs. So you get this disassociation, this disconnection from your body, and this inability to respond. And the same thing happens with a disconnection from yourself and your own ability to think for yourself and make decisions. We now have at least one, if not two generations of people who have lost the ability to think for themselves around food, because now they always need numbers or rules or another human being to tell them what to do in every eventuality of life. And obviously life isn't that way. Life is full of grey areas where you're caught out of your regular routine and so forth. And so now it's like, don't trust yourself. You are irrational. You can't be trusted. Don't make your own decisions. Just stick to the numbers at all costs. And so you lose the ability to think for yourself. So all of these things can just exacerbate this propensity to become a perfectionist. Now, is that always a foregone conclusion? No, but it's a strong likelihood. And for sure, if you are already struggling with your relationship with food, continuing with those approaches to food will perpetuate the problem and will make it worse. We see this every single time. Now, one of the things that some people will say is, yeah, but counting calories is the only way that I can maintain control. But it's the illusion of control. Because let's face it, if that method enabled you to maintain control, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You wouldn't be listening to me at this point. Is what you were doing before working? And so it's the illusion of control. It's slowly, silently, insidiously is destroying your self-control behind the scenes. Because like I say, you become a slave to the numbers. You become very anxious around the numbers or situations where you might not be in perfect control of the numbers. If you're in a situation where you have a day where you go over the numbers, maybe you start fudging the numbers in your app to try to make yourself feel better. Or maybe you just say screw it and you don't even bother inputting your data into the app in the first place. Loads of people do that, where they have a quote blowout and they think, what's the point? And they don't even input the numbers into the app in the first place. And so, like I say, it's not control. If you believe that the solution to your problems is greater degrees of control, greater degrees of precision, you're only fueling the problem. It's only making everything worse. Now, what are we going to do about this? There are some schools of thought that teach an approach to helping people to rewire their relationship with food and to develop more emotional freedom around food that teach something along the lines of eat whatever you want. Nothing's off limits. Let's get away from this concept of there's good foods and bad foods. Just if you fancy something, you're free to have it. And the intention is pure. I get why they're doing it. They are trying to train people out of perfectionism, out of this mindset of just obsessing over the minutiae, and get them to a place where they have this take it or leave it mindset around food. However, what we found in our experience, we've had so many clients reach out to us who have tried those types of methods, and it just ended up backfiring for them because they did as they were told. And if they fancied something, they allowed themselves to have it. But then they found that their weight started creeping up and up and up a bit more. And then it was followed by panic, which was then followed by a knee-jerk reaction all the way back the other way to try to quote unquote undo the damage. And what's the only way that they know how to attempt to do that is back to their excessive controlled perfectionism approaches, which again only leads to the all or nothing mindset. It's what fuels all of these rebound moments, but they don't know any better. And so it doesn't actually resolve the problem. So what's the solution? Well, like I mentioned at the start, of course, we can achieve emotional freedom around food, eliminate the compulsions around food, and at the same time, have health and body goals to look your best and feel your best year round. So how are we going to do that? Well, to keep this simple, first of all, I'll address the fat loss side of things, and then I'll address the overcoming binge or emotional eating side of things using food, which again, as I mentioned at the start, is only a tiny piece of the much bigger issue, but we still need to address it. We still need to provide a framework that enables people to achieve their goals, but again, in a way that works with their psychology instead of against it, instead of exacerbating these problems with the scarcity mindset, the all or nothing mindset, and perfectionism and so forth. So let's talk about fat loss first of all. So firstly, you don't need to be counting calories. In order to be able to be lean, fit, and healthy year round, instead of having to count calories, you can control what you eat, the types of ingredients, the types of foods that you turn to, and roughly in what proportions. And I say roughly because we don't need to be weighing it to get the ratios exactly right. Just simple visual portion control is sufficient. When you do this, you don't need to be counting calories because your hunger, energy, and cravings, as I'll get into in a bit, will regulate your food intake for you. Now, if you choose not to eat in the ways that I'm about to describe, if you were to follow a system such as what some people will teach, like IIFYM, if it fits your macros, where, okay, now you can eat all sorts of foods every single day as long as the macronutrient numbers fit within certain amounts. Now, now you're going to have to weigh food and track calories in an app. But if you prioritize eating in the ways that we are about to describe right now, you'll find it's so much easier and it eliminates so many other problems as well, especially when we start getting into health and whole minimally processed foods and great quality ingredients and so on and so forth. So anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing that we need to do when it comes to eating for fat loss is we still need to prioritize health. And it's mind-blowing when you think about it, how many people actually just wants to be slimmer, skinnier, lighter at the expense of health if that's what's required. Like that, they are willing to follow approaches that are going to be very detrimental to their body or to their health, provided that they just get the result they're after. So, but ultimately, it doesn't work. Right? It's always going to backfire. You might be able to force yourself to follow that for a certain period of time, but it's going to backfire. So any fat loss method has to prioritize health. It has to be via health. So you've got to have your values the right way around. Right? It has to be health number one. Now, when we prioritize health, so I mentioned earlier, yes, calories matter. We cannot get away from energy balance, calories in versus calories out. And in addition to that, metabolism and health and hormones matter too. Because if you are unhealthy, if your hormones are dysregulated and out of balance, then even if you force yourself into a calorie deficit, you're going to struggle. Food isn't going to go to the places that you want it to go. There's just going to be a cascade of problems. We need both. Of course, we need both. Of course, we need healthy metabolism, healthy hormones, and we need a calorie deficit if we want to lose body fat as well. But we're going to achieve a calorie deficit without counting calories, which is what we're coming on to now. It's just naturally going to happen. So we have to prioritize health. That's key. If you don't prioritize health, it will catch up with you. It will bite you in the ass later on. The other reason why we want to prioritize health is because when people are nutritionally deficient, then they're going to get cravings. Your body recognizes that you're depleted of certain things, and it needs to get those things in. It needs to get that sustenance in, whether it's vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, phytonutrients, whatever it is. Your body goes, well, I'm deficient in this thing, and the only way I'm able to get it in is through my food, so let's stimulate some cravings to try to get the food in. The problem is that we very often misinterpret those cravings, especially when somebody's unhealthy. But I'm sure many of you have had the experience of when you do prioritize health, when you're in one of those phases where you're exercising well, you're active, and you're eating well, you start to crave fresh foods. You start to crave nutritionally dense foods, right? Your taste changes, your preference changes, because your body now is very in tune with what you need, and you're able to interpret the signals in that way. But oftentimes when people are unhealthy, they misinterpret those signals, and they end up eating and experiencing these cravings, oftentimes because they're just nutritionally depleted and deficient, because the quality of the foods that they're eating, even though they're overeating, they're undernourished, because they're just eating really poor quality foods. So again, this is priority number one. So if we want to lose body fat through our nutrition, it has to be via health. The next thing for us to address is the thermic effect of food. So we can make fat loss so much easier when we prioritize foods that have a high thermic effect of food. What does that mean? The thermic effect of food is the amount of energy that is required in order to break a food down, to digest it, and to absorb and assimilate it. And the amount of energy required to do that is going to vary wildly between various food groups. So fat-dense foods have a very low thermic effect of food. I think it's in the region of something like 0 to 3% of the amount of energy contained with that food will be used up in the process of digesting and storing it. Carbohydrates, a little bit higher, maybe in the region of 10%, and there's going to be a range. Protein foods are 20 to 30%, way higher. Now, it's going to vary from food group to food group because some people will try to rely too heavily on protein shakes, for example, but there's a number of issues with protein shakes that they're not bad. I use protein shakes, but we have to be aware of the impacts that they do have. They have very low satiety and satiation. You'll be very hungry very quickly afterwards. But also the thermic effect of food, even though it's protein, it's still not going to be the same because in a way it's almost pre-digested, right? Of course, your body's going to require way more energy to break down and absorb a steak compared to a protein shake. So, of course, there's variation from food group to food group. It's not the same for all of them, but protein foods are going to have a higher thermic effect of food. So what that means is that if you can build your meals around a protein source first and foremost, then the thermic effect of food, of that meal goes up, which means that net, you end up with an absorption of way fewer calories. So that is just such a powerful, simple, easy strategy to make weight loss and fat loss so much easier. Is instead of your food groups being predominantly carb or fat based, make them predominantly protein based. And for the same amount of food, you're going to end up in a calorie deficit because of the thermic effect of food. Okay, the next thing is satiety and satiation. So satiety is the feeling of fullness in between meals, and satiation is how quickly you feel full and satisfied during a meal. So if we want effective fat loss and weight loss, we need to prioritize satiety and satiation. Which makes sense. If you're predominantly eating foods that are low in satiety and low in satiation, highly palatable, hedonistic foods, then you're just going to eat more and more and more. Whereas if we prioritize foods that have high satiety, high satiation, then when you're eating a meal, you feel full sooner because of satiation. That brings the eating episodes to an end quicker. And you keep hunger at bay longer in between meals. And also what you find is that your blood sugar levels and your hunger, energy, and cravings are regulated more smoothly in between meals. You don't get these peaks and troughs. It's much smoother and easier to navigate. So if we want effective fat loss, we want to prioritize these three things. Number one, health. Number two, thermic effect of food. Number three, satiety and satiation. Now, when it comes to satiety and satiation, how do we do that? Again, prioritizing protein. Protein foods have way higher satiety and satiation. So this is why we want to build our meals predominantly around a protein. Then also making sure that we've got adequate fiber in our meals and in our diet. And then also a moderate amount of additional fats and a moderate amount of carbohydrates. And I'll talk in a bit more detail later about how we're going to structure that, how we're going to organize that. But in order to provide satiety and satiation, if you follow a diet that's too low in fats, you're not going to feel satiated. Maybe you've tried that. Maybe you've had some meals where either consciously or accidentally the fat content was really low. And then chances are you found that there was something missing either from the meal or soon after you found yourself craving fat-dense foods. Equally with carbohydrates. If you eliminate carbohydrates and you become very depleted and your glycogen stores go through the floor, then it makes sense that you're going to start craving carbohydrates. Now, for sure, there's also the argument that people can propose, especially if you're, an avid fan of super low carb diets and keto and all of that, whereby we have these different metabolic pathways, right? And so if you're relying on one metabolic pathway the whole time, on converting carbohydrates ultimately into ATP, and that's your relied source, then in order to shift lanes and shift to another metabolic pathway, that requires time, and it requires a reorientation, if you like, internally, and in the short term, you'll get cravings. Yeah, I get all of that. But we find time and time again in our experience of working with clients, when they follow low carb diets for a prolonged period of time, it can often lead to the problems that we've already been discussing with on the wagon, off the wagon, and then they have their first taste of pizza or pasta, they go to an Italian, and then all hell breaks loose. And then all of a sudden they're off the wagon again, and so on and so forth. So what we find is that actually let's provide satiety and satiation by prioritizing protein, getting adequate fiber, and having a moderate amount of fat and a moderate amount of carbohydrates, depending on the individual and a number of factors that we can get into later. Then the final thing that I want to mention in terms of achieving fat loss and weight loss is we must incorporate our favorite processed foods on a regular basis. Now, sometimes we encounter people that have a real fear of that, and they just go, it's unnecessary. The body doesn't need it. And so why should I include these foods every single week when it's unnecessary? I don't need it. My body, my health, my physiology doesn't need these foods. But psychologically, you are training your brain into scarcity. You're training your brain that these foods are bad and off limits and can't be had. And it triggers that loss of control when you, quote, have a taste that we discussed earlier. And it also amplifies the fear. If you're afraid of something or you're anxious around something, the solution to that is not to avoid the fear. It's kind of like saying, oh, I'm afraid of public speaking, so in order to overcome my fear of public speaking, I'm never going to speak in public. You don't overcome the fear by avoiding it. And so this is the same. In order to train somebody into emotional freedom, we need to expose themselves to the situations they used to struggle in, not avoid them. And so by incorporating our favorite foods in moderation, in an appropriate moderate amount, whereby we're not having so much of it that we need to count calories again to make sure that we're not going over the numbers, because it's insignificant. But when you eat in this pattern, this is why we don't need to count calories with our clients. Anybody can be lean, fit, and healthy year-round with this approach. Now, lean is a relative term. What does that mean? For somebody starting from a place of being obese and they are unhealthy, then ultimately down the line, just purely by following this system, them being quote-unquote lean means they have a flat stomach. They have a flat stomach and they fit into the clothes that they want and they are healthy. For somebody else, lean, just purely by eating in this way, means they have a six-pack abs year-round. This is how Rachel and I stay in shape year-round, by never counting calories. And so if you're being told by somebody that the only way that you are able to be lean, fit, and healthy is to take things to a way more advanced, unnecessarily precise and controlled approach, then that's just a gap in their skill set. That's all. You've reached the end of that person's skill set. Because for sure, this is a separate skill set. This is different. There are things that we need to teach for how to apply this. But hopefully you can start to see how this is just such a simpler methodology, whereby let's just purely regulate what foods you turn to and have rough proportions and ratios that you can just look at your plate and go, okay, great, that's roughly enough protein, there's my veg, there's an adequate amount of fats, great, I'm good to go. That's a system you can do anywhere. You can do it when you're traveling, when you're in an airport, you can do it when you're socializing, when you're out at a restaurant with friends. It enables you to make last-minute changes based on either preferences. Maybe you just don't fancy having fish that evening and you'd like to change and eat something else. Or you're caught out of your regular routine. That's a very simple system that you can apply anytime, anywhere. Okay, a huge amount of what I have just discussed also enables us in the easiest way possible to help somebody to overcome their struggles with food. Whether it's binge eating, emotional eating, compulsive eating, mindless eating, or disordered relationship with food. The way that we approach nutrition in this way is actually going to help. Why? Let's go through them. Firstly, we are prioritizing health. Now, the more healthy somebody is, the easier it's going to be for them to be in tune with their body's needs and what their body really needs, and to be able to differentiate between physical hunger and emotional hunger. And this is a big area of struggle for so many people, is that they have no idea between the two, and one can often trigger the other. Physical hunger can often trigger emotional hunger. And so if somebody's struggling with things like insulin resistance and leptin resistance, right, so insulin resistance, when it gets worse and worse, that's ultimately what leads to type 2 diabetes. Leptin resistance is so one of the hormones that regulates your appetite in the same way that your cells can become less sensitive to the effect of insulin. So now your body has to produce more and more and more insulin. In the same way, the same thing can happen with leptin. And so now your brain doesn't get the signal that you've eaten enough. And when people are unhealthy and they've overeaten, they're overfed but undernourished, and they're overweight, then they will struggle with things like insulin resistance and leptin resistance. All of which ultimately feeds back into being so detached from your body's signals that it's very difficult to interpret what your body needs. So again, prioritizing health helps somebody to rewire their behavior and their relationship with food. So hopefully you can see how the more you dive into it, the less you can detach mind from body. They both work synergistically together. Also, as I mentioned earlier, that when somebody is overfed but undernourished, they will get cravings, because their body recognizes they are depleted of certain nutrients, so it's going to try to get those that nutrients in by triggering hunger and triggering cravings again. And so now we're back into being in a battle with yourself against cravings again. So any approach that is looking to make a proper, lasting change to somebody's relationship with food, it's got to prioritize health. All right, next up, we've got satiety and satiation again. So in order to rewire somebody's relationship with food, we have to satisfy physical hunger using our approach to nutrition. And of course, we have to resolve their struggles with emotional hunger, which is an entirely separate topic and is probably about 98% of what actually needs to be addressed. But we need to address the two. Now, if we are not eating foods and meals that have a high degree of satiety and satiation, then what that means is that somebody's going to struggle with cravings a lot, and it's very easy for physical hunger to escalate into emotional hunger again. So first of all, when they're in the middle of eating a meal, then if that meal has less satiation, then the signal to their brain to stop eating isn't going to be quite as clear. So this is one of the reasons why we emphasize prioritizing protein at each meal, is that when you build a meal around protein, your brain quickly and easily and very clearly gets the signal, awesome, I've eaten enough, I feel satisfied, let's move on. That signal is way clearer than it is with other foods. And also, if we're not providing satiety, then in between meals, then our hunger levels aren't going to be as well regulated. So we'll probably get hungry sooner, and we might have issues with blood sugar and hunger, energy, and cravings between meals. And so if we're eating in this way, then we are laying the framework and establishing at least a physical foundation that sets us up for success, that makes the whole process as easy as it can possibly be. Why wouldn't you want that? So the next thing that we need to address with our approach to nutrition, if we're going to help somebody to overcome binge eating or emotional eating, is simplicity. The simpler it can be, the better. Einstein has a quote, which is everything should be made as simple as possible, but not any simpler. And so complexity is the enemy of execution. And the more complex you make something, the more you're encouraging somebody into perfectionism again, that we discussed at the start. So in order to help somebody away from perfectionism, we have to teach simplicity. Now, of course, it needs to still get the results that they're after, but it needs to do so in the simplest way possible. And so that's why this approach to food that I'm talking you guys through right now is so powerful, because it's so simple and it gets away from complexity. And it's adaptable again. Like I mentioned earlier, you're able to do it when you're traveling, when you're caught out of your regular routine, and so forth. You can make last minute decisions and you can pivot so much more easily because it's so simple. You've got a basic, simple set of guidelines. You're just doing the basics, the fundamental basics, day in, day out, week in, week out, and it's easy. And you're able to do this and have a busy life at the same time. If you're a hardworking, busy professional with a demanding job, maybe you've also got a family at home, and you've got a busy lifestyle, you've got better things to be doing with your time than weighing your food, counting grains of rice into Tupperware, and taking your weighing scales into restaurants with you. You've got way better things to do with your time than that. And so those methods, it's just complete overkill. It's amazing how excessively complicated people make things. It's super simple. People love to overcomplicate the crap out of food, and it's ridiculously simple. But of course, you've got to have the entire package. It's not just about food. It's about having the mindset and the framework in place as well. Topic for another day. And then also, we need to incorporate our favorite foods on a regular basis. For the same reasons that I discussed a moment ago, we need to train somebody out of the scarcity mindset. So if we want to rewire somebody's relationship with food, they have to incorporate their favorite foods on a regular basis, but in moderation, in an appropriately moderated amount that enables them to achieve their goals without having to count calories. They know they've got the flexibility to enjoy their favorite foods, and when it fits with their strategy, when it's completely aligned with their personal standards, their health, fitness, and well-being goals, great, they can enjoy it in the appropriate amount. And if it isn't, great, they can move on and not give it a second thought, which obviously comes from training them in the rest of the mindset skills, because that's critical. We have to establish a take it or leave it mindset with food. But that comes down to the psychological training and the mindset training. That's not going to happen just by addressing food. So, what does this look like practically? Well, like I mentioned, first and foremost, we are going to build each of our meals around a protein. And our preference is an animal protein for the reasons that we've already discussed. Satiety and satiation, thermic effect of food, and so forth. Now, does this mean that if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, that's it, you're screwed? You can't eliminate binge or emotional eating and you can't be lean, fit, and healthy. Of course not. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is it's way easier if you do it with animal proteins. It's way simpler. Because if you're going to get your protein sources from non-animal options, then there's a couple of things that you have to accept as an inevitable consequence. One of them being that in order to satisfy hunger, energy, and cravings, in order to provide satiety and satiation, you will need to consume more calories. And in order to hit enough protein, you will need to consume carbohydrates with that. There are going to be carbohydrates that come along with it that are just inevitable. And that's just something that you have to accept. Now, again, does that mean that you're going to struggle with your relationship with food and with being overweight and all of that? No, of course not. It just means that it's not as optimal. Because again, what's the real reason why people are struggling? Because they're binging on processed foods. So if you keep your food sources as whole, minimally processed foods, you manage hunger, energy, and cravings appropriately, and you keep your favorite processed foods in appropriate moderation, simple, it's easy. But if we want to make our life as easy as possible and optimize results, if you want to optimize fat loss, then animal protein sources are where it's at. And if you want to make this process of providing satiety and satiation more easily, more effectively, then animal protein is going to help you to do that. So if you are a meat eater, awesome. Also, the other reason why we like to do that is simplicity, because if you're going to eat a vegan diet especially, but also to a certain degree a vegetarian diet, then you have to be much more conscientious in order to fulfill all of your nutritional requirements. So there are certain nutrients that are contained within meat and fish that, in order to get appropriate essential amino acids, in order to get other vitamins and minerals that are contained within meat, then you have to be more diligent. And again, complexity is the enemy of execution. And the more detailed and precise something has to be, then the more that can exacerbate somebody's propensity for perfectionism and the all or nothing mindset. Is that a foregone conclusion? Of course not. But it's a heightened risk. So it's just something to be aware of. So if you're committed to veganism, now if you're committed to veganism for health reasons, I would suggest there's a conversation to be had around that, because at the end of the day, human beings evolved as omnivores. Right? You will not find, I saw this online today, you will not find any cave paintings of salads. Right? Hunter-gatherers the world over have cave paintings all over the world of hunting animals. Right? So we evolved as omnivores. And so I believe that for optimal health, then we should eat as omnivores. But if you're committed to veganism for other reasons, animal welfare, etc., amazing. But if you are committed to that, then we have to be aware of, okay, well, there are these things that you have to accept as an inevitable consequence. But are you able to do all of this? Yeah, of course you can. So if you are a non-meat eater, then the advice is simple. Increase your protein intake as much as you possibly can using the food groups that are going to work for you. Eat whole, minimally processed foods, and satisfy hunger, energy, and cravings. I strongly discourage anybody, anywhere, to follow a system long-term that causes them to struggle with excessive degrees of hunger. Now, of course, we want to be appropriately hungry for meal times, but not to the point where you're chewing your desk and hankering for food and watching the clock for when you're going to get your next meal in. That's just not going to work. So manage hunger, energy, and cravings appropriately. As long as you do that and you keep processed foods to appropriate moderation, then great, you're good to go. So then for the rest of it, build your meal around a protein source. Then you're going to add vegetables to that. So we encourage people to have vegetables with most meals. And we like to have a mix of cooked vegetables and then raw fresh vegetables like salads throughout the week. Doesn't necessarily have to be throughout the day, but we definitely want that variety, that nutritional variety. And then an appropriate amount of additional fats. So some meats or fish like salmon, for example, there's going to be a decent amount of fat in salmon. So you don't necessarily need to add a great deal of fat to that meal. Now, if adding a little bit of oil to your salad dressing makes that palatable and provides satiety and satiation and enables you to enjoy that meal, and you're now able to stick to this method of eating forever, rock and roll. Have some salad dressing. Have some olive oil on your salad. But, fattier meats, typically we don't need to be adding a great deal of fats to that meal. But you can add a moderate amount of additional fats. And the guidelines that we use, we've discussed this in other episodes, but it's usually going to be 1.5 to 2 kind of thumb sizes of additional fats, or 1.5 to 2 tablespoons of additional fats for that meal. And then you're good to go. And then we're going to use carbohydrates strategically. And again, there's variation from individual to individual, but as a very broad generalization, for lots of people, what works really well is to have one carb meal, as in additional starchy carbohydrates, one carb meal where you're also going to add a carb serving to that meal. So the rest of it's the same. We've got our protein, vegetables, and then we're going to add some carbohydrates to that meal. One meal a day, and on training days, we'll usually have 2. So we're going to have usually one of those meals is going to be around the training session itself. That works well for a lot of people. It's not a one size fits all. And there are some people that do well having carbohydrates every single meal. There's individual variability, right? If you have high insulin sensitivity, you're already lean, you carry a lot of muscle tissue, you train hard, you're physically active most days, then you might actually do really well on carbs in every meal. So there's, individual variation. But for a lot of people, certainly for the majority of our clients who have body fat to lose, they want to lose body fat, they are busy, hardworking professionals with successful careers, and they've got a busy life outside of their work too, whether it's their own family or whatever it is that they do with their lifestyle, then that tends to work well for a lot of people. It's a good starting place for a lot of people. And that's it. It's super simple. That's how we do it. That is how you establish the framework that enables you to achieve your body goals, to be lean, fit, and healthy year round, and eliminate your struggles with food at the same time. So I want to finish this episode once again with doubling down on the emphasis of food is only 1 to maybe 5% of the real problem. What's the real reason why people are struggling with weight loss or fat loss? It's because of all of the fuck it moments. Moments like, it's been a bad day, it's been a long day, it's been a stressful day. I deserve a break. I deserve a night off. Justifications like, just this once. I promise this is the last time. This is the last time. I really mean it this time. This is the last time. Why do just this once and this is the last time never mean just this once or this is the last time? Because you're setting a standard for your brain that this is an acceptable standard. The message your unconscious mind receives is that any time that life gets tiring enough or stressful enough or inconvenient enough, it's okay to bullshit yourself and break your own promises to yourself. So you justify it once, then you justify it again, and then just this once becomes your standard that lasts for years. So it's not just this once. Or other fuck it moments like, wow, you're going to binge eventually anyway, so you might as well do it now. Or, well, it's a bad day. It's a bad day, so might as well write the rest of the day off. And even enjoy it. And indulge. And start again tomorrow and start again on Monday. Or other moments like, I can't be bothered to stand up for myself in front of my friends. I can't be bothered to justify my choices to my mum or my colleagues yet again. So I'll just do what they're doing, just to keep the peace or keep the heat off my back. It's moments like this. These are the real reasons why people are struggling with weight loss and fat loss. Constantly on the wagon, off the wagon, struggling with compulsions where their brain is screaming at them. Compulsions that feel completely out of their control. It feels like another part of you takes over. None of these quote-unquote fuck it moments have anything to do with diet or nutritional strategy. Everybody's obsessing over what's the best nutrition plan, what's the best training plan. And people say, the best diet is the one that you can stick to. Which leads people to believe that the solution is, I just need to find the diet that I can stick to and all my problems will be solved. Instead of realizing, well, yeah, for sure, following unhealthy, unsustainable approaches to food that breed perfectionism and the all or nothing mindset is definitely going to make your struggles worse. But establishing a fully personalized, healthy, sustainable system that 100% is going to get you to your body goals in the simplest way it can possibly be on its own isn't enough without the psychological frameworks in place, which is why it's so important to address all of the other stuff that we talk about in this podcast, the emotional fitness side of things. So anyway, hopefully that gives a bit more context, a bit more understanding for why we do what we do with our clients, what's required to be lean, fit, healthy, look your best, feel your best year round in a simple, sustainable way, and be able to establish emotional freedom around food. Because I think there are some schools of thought that are teaching people that in order to establish emotional freedom, then your body goals should be thrown by the wayside. And of course, we can't be going for unhealthy body goals, right? Where people are getting on stage and they're so lean and depleted that they've lost their menstrual cycle. That's not health. That's violating one of the principles I said earlier. It has to be via health first. So of course, we can't be doing that. But of course, you can have body goals. Of course, you could be lean, fit, and healthy and have emotional freedom at the same time. Anyway, I hope you found that super useful. That's enough from me. If you would like help with struggles with binge eating, emotional eating, or disordered relationship with food, then reach out to us to find out about our flagship program, Chase Life Intensive. You can book in for a consultation. You can book in for a call by going to our website, chaselifeconsulting.com. You can also email Rachel directly at rachel@chaselifeconsulting.com. Otherwise, we will see you in the next episode.